Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Sage, who just stood up. He's right here. He's also our program chair. You know him by sight, but maybe not his background. He received his BA and MA from the University of Michigan and his PhD from the University of Toronto. He taught classics full-time at the University of Waterloo in Canada and at the University of Cincinnati and part-time at UCSD. He's published a number of books about Greek and Roman history and has written numerous articles for journals and encyclopedias. He was the recipient of our very own Helen Hawkins Award last year, and he's currently writing the book for which he received the grant. So in addition to doing programs, he is very, very busy working on yet another book. His topic today is the Roman Republic in Stone. He'll say a few words about our October program before he starts. Thank you.
Thank you. Our speaker in October will be Dr. Stanford Lakoff from the UCSD. Can you hear me or not?
Let me use the mic. We've got all ears back here.
Oh, all right. Let me turn it up. Okay.
Just get close to your mouth to this thing.
It's okay? Everybody, yes. Okay. Is Dr. Stanford Lakoff, Edward A. Dixon, Professor Emeritus of Political Science from the University of California at San Diego. He will speak, well, first of all, he has, after getting his degree from Harvard, he's gone on to a brilliant career, publishing any number of books and articles. He will speak on the Arab-Israeli conflict in October 20th, if I'm not mistaken. So please plan to attend. It should be a very interesting lecture. Okay, now I'll put on my other hat. This lecture grows out of the project that I began with the help of SDIS. It is an attempt to look at the Roman Republic from a later perspective. What was it like for later Romans, once the Republic had passed into history, to look back? What did they think about it? One way to imagine that, and we'll talk about this culture, is to look at their architectural and statuary productions, which are often political. And so they give us some idea about later attitudes. And by their distribution, by the way, they say a lot about how the situation had changed once the Republic came to an end. So it grows out of that. The project involves text as well, but texts don't look as good on slides. Okay? So I decided to focus on the archaeological remains that we have. And we do have extensive remains, and it's focused on Rome. There's lots of material outside, scattered throughout the empire. Some of it very, very important, but I thought to keep this in a reasonable compass, I would concentrate on the material at Rome itself. Most of this material, actually a lot of it I should say, in the Roman Forum, which I gave you that little plan of, was unearthed during the 1930s, the broad unearthing, by Mussolini, by order of Mussolini, who strongly valued the identification between modern Italy, what was then modern Italy, and the ancient Roman Empire. So we owe an indirect debt, if you will, to Mussolini's project on the Roman Forum. Okay, let me start by talking a little bit about our relationship to the past. Okay? It obviously plays a vital role both on a personal level. It's crucial to our social and self-identity, how we function. Without memory, we in a sense lose ourselves. Okay? The same is true for, by the way, let me say something a little bit more. That memory is to some extent fluid. It was a long time called memories change to some extent. There's a core that remains, but the way we think about those memories and the way we interpret those memories change according to our circumstances. And what may have been an embarrassing moment once, you can remember in a very, very different way, which avoids the embarrassment. And people do that. I know I do it. I don't think that's unusual. Someone once called it the memory of memories. That is, we have memories of our own memories because we reconstruct them as we go along. They are also crucial for social groups, not just states, but individual social groups as well. They are what forms one of the most important bonds between members of that group. Memories there, if you will, change and develop as well. To give you an example of social memory, something from my own life, when I was very young, we used to we used to remember Pearl Harbor Day. I don't know how many of you older folk like me remember this. It's basically disappeared. Right? And if you notice from 2001 till 2018, the memory of 9/11 is slowly beginning to dissipate as well. So that in social context, memories change as well. They develop and they disappear if they're no longer, to some extent, the social ones particularly, if they're no longer relevant. Presidents' birthdays become lumped together. I remember when I was a kid, there was Washington's birthday and there was Lincoln's birthday. But now it's President's Day. Right? But what they are trying to do to some extent is recover an unrecoverable past. We can't recover the past as it was experienced at the time by the people who lived through it. What we can recover, okay, are elements that essentially matter to us. And that can be done. It becomes crucially important when we develop middle grade, when we can write. At that point, we can memorialize the past, and we begin to be able, to some extent, to criticize our versions of the past, one version against another. It's much harder if you have just an oral culture in which everything resides in people's memories. Rome, as in other ancient societies, and modern ones as well, memory and history were very, very important to social cohesion. Rome, perhaps more than most other ancient societies, was historically oriented. And I'll explain to you why that might be. It developed historical writing on the basis of Greek influence, but it didn't begin, interestingly enough, maybe until very late in Rome's history. The first written history we know of did not occur until around 200 BC, long after the Greeks had developed history at least almost 3 centuries earlier. Its methods and techniques were also borrowed from the Greeks. It was used to memorialize Rome's success. Important, that is, its expansion as an empire and the greatness of the Roman people. Literary texts were used, but equally important were concrete memorializations. I don't mean concrete, literally made of concrete. I mean definite, right? Memorializations. But if you look into, now all of this, the building styles and everything else were borrowed from the Greeks. It was a Roman contribution, that is concrete later on, but basically the basic architecture of Roman buildings, public buildings, is Greek in inspiration. Often done by Greek craftsmen from the eastern half of the empire. And therefore it forms an interesting counterpoint. We're going to compare the reliefs on two different structures, historical reliefs in a sense, and the work we're looking at is the Parthenon first, okay? And what I'm looking at on the Parthenon is this rectangular space, a metope, here. It was built between 447 and 422, for any if it's important. Okay. This is from one of the metopes of the Parthenon. Okay? It portrays a battle between the centaur and a people called the Lapiths. Again, it's of no great importance in and of itself. It was a fight that broke out at a wedding when the centaurs, okay, tried to run off with the bride and the other women present. They are, in Greek mythology, they are traditionally seen as lustful and uncontrollable. But they are actually related to the Lapiths because their father, the ancestor of the centaurs, is in fact the father of the groom at this particular marriage. What this symbolizes is Athens' victory over Persia. And actually the proceeds for the temple came from that victory and the empire Athens established afterwards. You can see that it is a metaphorical, right, struggle. It's a struggle of reason against passion, but it's also the struggle of Greeks against Persians. Let's now turn to a Roman battle scene on a structure. Oops, sorry. This is from a monument called the Aemilius Paulus Monument. It's at Delphi in Greece, if anybody's interested. It marks a victory in battle. In 168, the Roman consul, commander Aemilius Paulus, defeated the forces of the Macedonian king. And a peace was concluded in the next year, which essentially ended kingship in Macedonia. Okay? To commemorate that, a column was erected with the statue of the general on horseback on top. But for us, what is most important at the base of that statue is a historical relief portraying that battle that was decisive in the war. And unlike the Greek relief, which is a sort of mythological portrayal of what happened, this relief, this is the battle. It's on 4 sides. We know from our best source about this battle that what started the battle was a horse from the Roman side escaped and ran across the river, and the Romans pursued to get the horse to get it back, and then general fighting broke out. Okay. There's the horse. Notice it's got no saddle, it's rearing away. That is, Roman historical reliefs and portrayals of battles are concretely historical. They're not mythological. They try to portray, given the compass of what you have available here, the reality as closely as possible. And there's a reason for this. Let me go into the reason. Okay. And for that, I'll have to do a little Roman history. First, let me cite a passage from probably the greatest of all Roman historians, a man called Tacitus. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. Very difficult Latin, by the way. At any rate, what he says, writing in the early 2nd century AD or CE, whichever method you particularly use, right? He wrote a history, let me just put it in more context. He wrote a history of the early Roman emperors down to the year 68, the year Nero committed suicide, and civil war broke out again. In that year, what he wrote was, he's now giving you a capsule history of Rome's political history. In the beginning, Rome was ruled by kings. Lucius Brutus brought liberty and instituted the consulate. Dictatorships were used from time to time, and there were other brief interruptions of freedom. That's the key, of freedom. The power of Pompey and Crassus quickly passed to Caesar. Anthony and Lepidus were defeated in battle by Augustus, who then gained control of the state, a state exhausted by civil conflict with the title of first citizen. Then he goes on to the history begins at the death of the first emperor Augustus. Okay. And he goes on to say, at home all was tranquil. This is 14 AD, if you're interested. And there were magistrates with the same titles, that is, the Republican titles. There was a younger generation sprung up since the victory of Augustus. And even many of the older men had been born during the Civil Wars. How few were left who had seen the Republic. All looked up to the commands of a ruler. Few may have seen it, but many remembered it. And let me now give just a short chronology. This is the traditional chronology. There was actually earlier attestation of settlement, at least temporary settlement at the site, but around the middle of the 9th century BC. Okay. Traditionally, the regal period, Rome was governed by 7 kings. In fact, at least 3 of them are not historical at all. They're inventions. Romulus being probably the most famous of these inventions. His name means Little Roman, so you can get something from that. Okay, then 509 begins the Republic, and we'll talk about what that means. The traditional date for the Republic is 509 to 30 BC. Okay? Then the Empire, the imperial period begins, and you know, these are dates like this are arbitrary. People don't wake up the next morning and say, God, we're in the Middle Ages. But traditionally, it is set at 30 is the beginning of the empire. And let me just say something. They had an empire in the Republic. It was constructed for most of it in the Republic. Just traditionally, that term empire is used in 2 senses in Roman history. One sense is to denote a period from 30 to 395. Okay? And that's the sense we'll be using today. The second, then in 395, there's an emperor with 2 sons, and already there have been hints. The empire splits into 2 halves, an eastern half and a western half. Basically, if you drew a line down the Adriatic Sea, the sea to the east of Italy, to the east of it would be the Eastern Empire, to the west, Western Europe, and parts of North Africa would be the Western Empire. And the west goes under in the 5th century. In theory, the east becomes the Byzantine Empire and goes on until the Turks capture Constantinople in 1453. It's all, well, these are definite dates, but this is all kind of fluid. And as particularly the early period, as archaeological sites are dug and things are uncovered, there's going to be some change. Right? But it gives you at least the chronological spread. You can see it mimics to some extent what Tacitus says. But to understand this split, and understand what these people were looking back at, let's say a little bit about the Roman Republic. Okay? When the kings were expelled, and they certainly were, they were replaced by 2 annual magistrates. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just sort of what I think is relevant. Who were called consuls. And unlike the kings, even though they possessed absolute power, 2 things limited their power. The first is the office was annual. So at the end of the year, they became, if you will, private citizens again. Secondly, each consul could say no to the other consul. So they acted, it could lead to disaster, as you might guess sometimes, and it did. When they disagreed, say at a battle, one guy, there's one instance where later on, one of the consuls wants the same glory, fighting him, so one guy just walks off when the enemy attacks, and they're both defeated in the end. So it has its limitations. At any rate, over time, these 2 consuls, their offices were supplemented by a set of other offices. Okay? And what developed is a hierarchy of offices. So over time, you could pursue a career starting, generally they started 25 would be a reasonable year, at the very, very bottom. Okay? And if they reached high enough, and it depended on which period it was, they became members of an advisory body, the Senate. The Senate had no, in theory at any rate, had no power to determine anything. It could only advise the magistrates on their actions. But since it was full of ex-magistrates, men who might become magistrates again, the magistrates listened to the Senate. And by, say, 250 BC, the Senate was the most important political organ in the Roman state. Election to these offices, these magistracies, was highly competitive. By the way, the offices were unpaid, so that in theory, though, they were open to every Roman citizen, male citizen, I should say. Remember, these are strongly patriarchal societies. It's important to keep that in mind. And women could influence politics, but only indirectly, not directly. They could not hold political office. I'm sorry, but I lost my... Okay, it was highly competitive. As I said, the offices were unpaid, and what happened in the end is the offices were mostly held by the elite, as you might guess, the wealthy elite, and even within the elite, a core who over time monopolized most of the important offices in the state. The liberty that was offered to a great extent was what has been called negative liberty. I don't know if anybody has heard this term before. It is liberty that is meant freedom from constraint. There is also a version called positive liberty where you have the ability to develop and shape yourself. There are no restraining. So you can use that liberty to do something rather than simply use the liberty not to be bothered in doing something. The key to electoral victory rested on two important factors. The first was obviously wealth. Right? The richer, the better. Second thing was family descent. Among the elite in particular, family descent played a crucial role. It was remembered by the electors when they voted. We know something about some political speeches. Candidates would appeal to the electors on the basis of their ancestry. My grandfather was consul and he beat the X. And military success was the most important accomplishment that a man, it's the surest route to office. Okay, this is a panel from the Arch of Titus in Rome. It's the most, if you will, best preserved of the Roman triumphal arches. It's to mark Titus's victory over the Jews and his capture of Jerusalem in 71 AD. It was built by his brother about a decade later. He died early. I can do this without tripping. The parade consisted of three separate parts. It consisted of the captives and the spoils that resulted from the victory. It was also the army, part of the army that had won the victory, also accompanied in the parade. At the center was the man who triumphed. In this case, that would be Titus. Unfortunately, his head is gone. He rode in a 4-horse chariot, white horses, and was dressed in a purple robe imitating the chief god of the Roman state, Jupiter. His clothing mimicked that of the chief god. And you can see here, this a metaphor, it is the goddess Victory, who is holding a victory wreath over his head. There is a story, it occurs in a later source, that a slave stood behind the triumphing general and kept whispering in his ear, "Remember you are mortal. Remember you are mortal." Whether that's true or not, we don't really know. But anyway, these were a parade of spoils. Basically, at the end, he went out to the most important temple in Rome, the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, and sacrificed to the god, and that was the culmination. One of the things that resulted from being a victorious general was not only prestige, but wealth. Quickest way to gather wealth in the ancient world, I suppose it might still be, is to, in a different sense sometimes, is to take it from other people. And when the Romans won a victory and conquered the enemy, a large proportion of the spoils went to the commanding general. Okay? And that money was used to create monuments, personally to the general, but also to the general's family, in the form of statues and buildings in public spaces. They were evidence of his greatness, but also the greatness of his family. And the Roman elite memorialized their achievements, okay? Quite consciously and quite consistently. At the funeral, okay, generally a member of the family, often the eldest son, gave a review of the deceased's achievements and military successes in particular. And recollections of these successes did not end with the eulogy and the funeral. In the entranceways to Roman elite houses, the atrium, sort of a rectangular space, had niches in it. And the funeral masks of the deceased, eminent deceased members of the family were placed in those niches, often with a little inscription under them memorializing their achievements. Buildings and public statues serve the same purpose. They impress potential voters as well as visitors. We know from the example of Cicero how important the idea of living on through one's achievements was. Let me read a famous passage to you. And it's not only the prospect of celebrity in ages to come that impels me to grasp what I may call the hope of immortality, but I desire, this is Cicero, his vanity was boundless, but also that I desire that I have mentioned, to be mentioned, to enjoy it in the full while I'm still alive. Their ideas, by the way, of immortality are much fuzzier. It's not clear. Some believed in it, some didn't, in life after death. So these buildings and so forth, and even the funeral, for instance, one of the things you did, particularly in the imperial period, when an emperor disgraced an eminent individual, a determined attempt was made to erase his name and achievements from monuments. It was called condemnation of his memory, damnatio memoriae. One striking instance is in 22 AD, Julia, is that, no, that can't be right. Yes, Julia, I'm sorry, Julia, the sister of Brutus, Brutus who assassinated Caesar, died, and a funeral procession was held. Normally in an elite funeral, you had actors dressed as earlier members of the family who achieved things. They paraded with the coffin, wearing the death masks of these ancestors. One of the striking things is that two eminent members of the family were missing, Brutus and Cassius. As Caesar's assassins, the emperor had forbidden their appearance. This attempt to wipe out. Just as memory is important, the converse of memory being important is that getting rid of that memory when you want to destroy someone. A major center for this kind of display was the Roman Forum. And I've given you a handout. By the way, these are sculptures. This statue was made in the late 1st century BC, still during the Republican period. And these busts are really his ancestors' death masks. But you can't really do a mask. It's not easy to do it in sculpture. Not as impressive. All right. The major center during the Republic for this kind of display was the Roman Forum. I added this slide. You can see the fairly central position of the Roman Forum. And its position and its fact that it was flat led to its development. It started out as a cemetery in the 7th century and a swamp. And gradually over time it was drained and became first a market, then a public gathering place, and then a place for political activity. It was here during the Republican period that the majority of public buildings and statues commemorating Romans were found. To give you just a hint at what it's been estimated that by 500 AD, long after the Republic had passed, there were 3,785 statues of individuals on foot and another 22 statues of individuals on horseback. So all through antiquity it remained a very active center. Okay. Now you may ask, by the way, the statues themselves probably were not recognizable in the sense that their face, who 100 years on is going to recognize somebody's face just straight on? So they had little inscriptions under them telling you what the fellow had done and who he was and what he had done. Okay? And that raises another question. If that is the case, who could read the inscription? Right? In ancient society, literacy, it's been estimated. How they do this, I don't know. I'm just giving you a figure I have found. Something like 10 to 15% of people could read. Now, what reading, that just means they're literate. They wouldn't sit down with a book of German philosophy and read. But, you know, they could at least get their way. There were merchants and others who had some experience with reading and often with writing as well. And presumably the other side of it was we know they read it. We have indications in ancient sources that people did occasionally stop by and look at the inscriptions. And presumably for those who couldn't read, those who could have told them what the inscription was. So the audience that could probably do it, if they pay any attention at all, was probably 20% could actually get at it. Whether they accessed it or not is something totally different. Buildings, statues are statues, but Roman attitude toward public buildings, and they're almost all a result, not of the state, but of these individual families who fund them, is rather different than our own. When a historical building here, we make every attempt to save it, and if it's fallen into disrepair, to repair it, and particularly to get it back to its individual state. I mean, its prior state, its original state. The Roman attitude was totally different about this kind of thing. These buildings were built and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries. And what happened was that when they were rebuilt, they were often built in a totally different style. There was no attempt to preserve the original appearance of the building. What they did was, the crucial thing for them was the possession of the spot. So they could then rebuild whatever way they wanted and still memorialize their family. So it's a very different attitude. These areas, this forum and the adjacent areas, serve as theaters of memory. What's been called theater. I don't know if anybody's heard that term. Let me explain what I mean by that. This was a technique that was used as late as the Renaissance, developed by the Greeks, and what it consists of is and oratory is extremely crucial in Roman society. It's the way you get elected, it's the way you win cases in court, it's the way you influence laws and so forth. So, and often the speeches by our standards are extremely ornate and ornamented with all sorts of allusions to X and Y. So how does an orator, without the most staggering memory possible, keep the speech in his mind when he gives it? And the answer is this technique of places. It gave rise to our word commonplace. What they did was they would walk through a building and familiarize themselves, and often the buildings had interior niches where there were statues and other things, and familiarize themselves with each niche. So Then they could eventually, after a few times through it, in their mind, they no longer had to physically walk through the building. They could memorize it and do it in their mind. Then what they did was to divide their speech into sections and attach those sections to statues in each of those niches. So to remember a speech, you, in your mind, walked back through the various places because you put them there in order and parts of the speech would be remembered. And it worked. And to some extent, the forum functioned in the same way. Right? These public buildings and so forth functioned in the same way. Let me give you an example. You have it. All right, there's the forum. If you look, yeah, you can sort of see it. In the lower right, your handout, I think it's the same. No, some of them are different. In the lower right-hand corner here is a temple of Castor and Pollux. It's just called here. Castor had the bigger press than Pollux did, so he got the title. At any rate, it was the oldest abandoned building in the late Republic, the period we're talking about, really the last century BC. And it commemorates a battle and a Roman victory in 493 over neighboring Latin peoples. So it's a way of remembering, right, when somebody walked through it, that victory and its importance to the Romans. Nearby was what in the Republican period was the largest public building here, the Basilica Aemilia. Again, it was on the initiative of a family to celebrate initially a victory in war, and it is basically a place for public business, lawsuits and other sorts of things. Let me show you Temple of Castor and Pollux. There's a restoration of it. And this is the Aemilia today. How archaeologists restore this stuff is. This is a restoration of the last version. Yes, they typically had statues all around. Then by the last century, middle of the last century, we see a new basilica. Basilica is just a meeting hall, usually used for procedures at law, but it can be used for other sorts of things as well. And it gave its name to Catholic basilicas because they used this form originally as a form for constructing churches. Okay, Basilica Julia, whose construction was begun by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, and then his assassination prevented him from completing it. So his successor, we'll talk about that, a man called Augustus, completed it later on. The family name of Caesar was Julian or Julius. Gaius Julius Caesar, that middle name, Julius, is his clan name. Romans are really unusual. Romans are really unusual because they have more than one name. In most of the ancient world, you were daughter of or son of your father. In Italy, a different naming system developed over time, in which basically at its most developed, well, the longest name I know is 37 names long. That's much later. What do you call them? What name do you use? Anyway, in this time, the standard name has three parts. The first part is Gaius, right, for Caesar, and that is pre-name, pre-nomen. And there are only 20 or 30 of them. So it must have been hard to distinguish one kid from another. Okay? The middle name is in his case, Julius, or Tullius for Cicero, and that is part of a clan system which included the family. And then Caesar is the lesser family within this larger clan. So there's a whole group of Julius Caesars coming down through the generations. And then over time, the name expanded because initially the names, female names, unfortunately, are much simpler. Often they're simply a Junia. Remember I talked about the funeral of Junia? Brutus's middle name, this clan name, is Junius. So her name is just the female version of the clan name. Sometimes they were just numbers, sexta and so forth, or six. So that it is named after his family. I'm not going into greater detail. That's how it gets the name Julia, even though Caesar had constructed it. He then also built a forum, another forum in addition to the Roman forum, right near, okay, the Roman forum. And it had as its a temple as its center part, and that is the temple of Venus, because Caesar claimed Venus as his ancestor. And we'll go into that a little bit later on. And again, this really was built for the overflow of legal traffic. It's quite a litigious society. They talk about the U.S. being litigious. The Romans were equally litigious. By his assassination in 44, this was the Roman Empire. It stretched all the way from Spain in the west, and there had been a foray into England, into Britain, but it had not yet been conquered at this point. And right all the way to basically the Euphrates River here in modern Syria and Iraq. Right? It included much of the coast of North Africa, okay, particularly Carthage, right, there. And not yet, but it was going to add, within a few years, Egypt, okay, by the end of our period. And then later on, add Britain, and then Dacia, which is modern Romania, basically kind of parts of modern Romania. It was an immense empire. That's important. It was built certainly in the Western world. I don't know enough about China. It was by far the largest empire the Western world had ever seen. So it's important to bear that in mind. The reason I mention and go over it is that by, let us say, 50 BC, the Roman Republic was in deep trouble. With this immense empire and the wealth that flowed from it, it allowed competition. Remember, it had always been electoral competition, but now the spoils for which they were competing was so much greater. And those spoils, the money and wealth that flowed, enabled them to create armies, pay for those armies, and eventually fight each other. That is, any oligarchy, for it to work, you need the members of the oligarchy to have an agreed set of rules. I will do this, but I won't do that. And they have to count on others in the oligarchy also to obey those same rules. What had happened is those rules had broken down. And now there was no limit to the competition at all. Also, there had been a tremendous change in the army. The constant Roman wars and the posting of these armies overseas had led to a growing professionalization of the army. Initially, it started out as a peasant militia. People from the countryside were recruited, they marched, whatever it is, somewhere in Italy. They fought, and then when the fighting season, which was usually late spring, summer, and early fall, was over, they went back to their farms, only to be called up again in the next year. But being stationed in Spain, being stationed in Syria, meant that that was no longer possible. So that men turned to their military service more and more for their livelihood and also for their prospects after they became too old to serve. There was no mechanism provided by the state because the state was based on a militia system. And so they began to look to their commanders, both for their pay and also for their prospects after, military service was over. So the army became more and more detached from the state and more attached to the individual generals who commanded these forces. What resulted was a half-century of civil wars, beginning in around 90 BC, which finally came to an end with Caesar's victory in 45. But his assassination released another set of wars, which lasted for another 15 years, approximately until 30 BC. Caesar was an amazing general, but as somebody once said, Talleyrand, a minister of Napoleon, you can do everything, sire, with bayonets, but sit on them.
Say that again?
You can do everything with bayonets, sire, but sit on them. In other words, peace. How do you deal with peace?
Yeah.
His successor, we'll talk a little bit, Augustus, may not have been the general that Caesar was, but he created a stable and enduring political system. He needed to establish this new system. He needed two things. He needed an army which was obedient to him, and he created that by, first of all, totally professionalizing the military force, and that army now depended on him, not the state, him, for its pay, its working conditions, and most importantly, its bonus at the end of military service, which was substantial. So that he had fairly direct control over the army. No one could challenge him militarily. The second thing he needed was, remember, the Roman Republic, the magistrates who had carried out duties as governors, as magistrates in Rome, and so forth, were members of the aristocracy. So the second thing he needed to survive and create a stable political system was the cooperation of the aristocracy. Okay? And he did this in two ways. He preserved the outward form of the republic, same names and everything like that for the consuls and other magistrates, and he created a patronage system centered on himself. So that he was the one who gave office, in a sense. He was the one who rewarded individuals. And he kept their loyalty by particularly maintaining a fiction, a corpse that he reanimated, so to speak, and that was the Republic. Because now all power was concentrated in Augustus, there was no Republic really anymore. Okay? But what he did was he created a sort of simulacrum of the Republic. It looked like the Republic, but it wasn't the Republic. At his death, found among his papers, was a statement, a kind of short account of his own accomplishments. It was put up outside his mausoleum, and we have copies, not from Rome, but from other places of it. And I want to read the last paragraph, of that work. What he says is, in my 6th and 7th consulships, this would be 28 BC and 27 BC, after I had extinguished civil war and at a time when, with universal consent, I was in complete control of affairs, I transferred the Republic from my power to the domination of the Senate and people of Rome. For this service of mine, I was named Augustus by decree of the Senate. His actual name had been Octavian. And then when he was adopted, let me just say this, he was adopted by Julius Caesar. Caesar had no male heirs. He had a daughter, but he had no male heirs. And so he adopted Octavian, who became Augustus. After that time, I exceeded all in influence, but I had no power greater than others who were my colleague in each magistracy. So what he's saying to you, he's claiming the Republic is still alive, still functioning. And that he owes this position not to his success in war, and and monopolization of powers, but the normal choice of the Roman people. So the Republic is not dead. It's still, in a sense, in structure, functioning. The theme of that restored republic is most evident in this structure. He created a new forum as well. Okay. This is called the Forum of Augustus. It is larger than Caesar's Forum. And all of the forum have its basic structure of colonnades surrounding a central open space, often with a temple. Okay, let me say something about this temple. This temple was vowed after Augustus had defeated Brutus and Cassius. Actually, Anthony defeated him, but he got in on the victory anyway. The temple is called the Temple of Mars Ultor, U-L-T-O-R, Mars the Avenger, okay, to commemorate his avenging of Caesar's death. We'll talk about the temple a little separately. The colonnades on both sides, as you can see, had niches in which statues were present. The western side was, this is wrong. I couldn't find any other plan. The plan is wrong. On this side, the colonnade had members of the Julian family. Back to Venus and so forth. On this side were the men who were thought to have been the most important in developing of the empire. And that was continued. I'll talk about it in these outsides. The temple itself is probably in some ways. By the way, notice that in the middle is a statue of Augustus in a chariot, four-horse chariot, engraved with Father of his country, which he was awarded in 2 BC as well. The most important part of this area, to the west and east of the temple, are these circular areas here. In the western side are the most prominent members of the Julian family, which of course had been Caesar's family, but is now his family as well. They included Aeneas, the founder of the Julian line, supposedly. I put together a little slide. It gets a little complicated. It's not, it's amateurish, but it's the best I can do. The goddess Venus, this is often the case in ancient aristocratic families. They claim descent from a divinity. And to understand that, you need to think their concept of divinity was not our own. In the sense that what separated human beings and gods was really basically two things, like Superman. They had superhuman powers. They can, cross-speeding, I can't remember what they used to say. At any rate, and importantly, they are immortal. Human beings die, the gods do not. But physically, they're no different than a bunch of quarreling aristocrats, for the most part. They're modeled, obviously, on what originally were aristocratic courts, and they had relations, sometimes raped mortal women. In this case, Venus fell in love with Anchises. They had a son, Aeneas. Has anybody come across Aeneas before? Okay. He was a Trojan. And by this time, Rome had worked out a mythological ancestry that it was founded by fleeing Trojans. You find this in Europe and elsewhere, early medieval Europe, where they, for instance, the earliest history of the British Isles has a fleeing Trojan called Brutus, founding the British kingdom. At any rate, Creusa unfortunately drops quickly, But Aeneas, gave birth to a boy called Ascanius, whose name conveniently later on is changed to this, Julius, which you can see develops into Julius. Right? And then the Roman mythographers and historians discovered something important. The Greeks said the Trojan War was around 1200 BC. But traditionally the founding of Rome had been in the 8th century. So it can't be directly founded by Aeneas, unless he lived to be Methuselah's age. Right? So what developed, they basically made up a line of kings for a town close to Rome, in the Alban Hills, southeast of Rome. And one of the members of that family, the wife, was imprisoned by a nasty usurper, and Mars came to her because he lusted after her, and they produced a child, 2 children actually, I left out the other one, Romulus and his brother Remus. They founded Rome, so they founded Rome at the appropriate time. So all of this is a mechanism to get from a Trojan ancestry down to the traditional founder of Rome, little Roman Romulus. Okay, so to go back. Skipping the page. So all of these are, what we talked about are here on the western semicircle. It's called an excedrin. Okay? Here in the south, and this is true in both actually in this side. Remember, these are all Julians, that's wrong. Sumi-wiri are the highest men, the most important. Here they are. That is a line of Roman worthiness, to use an old-fashioned expression, And in here, okay, Romulus, right, the founder, and then the others, culminating in Augustus. So Augustus is not the death of the Republic. He is its culmination. And the Republic is still in existence. That's the propaganda. Well, no, we do things as elaborate as this today as well. Just wanted to, okay. Even after Augustus' death, it was still writers who portrayed this version that the Republic was still in existence. Though as time passed and constraints grew, it was beginning to seem as if the Republic was farther and farther away and really no longer in existence. Well, let me say one other thing. Let me add a sort of little bracket, and that is, we think of the Republic, it's portrayed in these writers as a time of freedom. For the most of the populace, it was of no significance. They could vote. There were constraints on their votes. They could elect people to office. They could pass laws. But there were constraints. It's revealing. After the news had come down that Brutus and Cassius and some fellow senators had assassinated Caesar, the senators, the assassins rushed out. There were about 60 of them. Rushed out into the forum. The Senate House was in the forum, expecting a rapturous welcome. They had to flee up to the Capitoline Hill for their lives. The people were angry. Caesar had been a benefactor to the populace. And in fact, normally you don't bury people in the city limits of Rome. You have to take them outside. There are a famous line of tombs along the Appian Way leading south of the city. And they cremated Caesar's body. They seized his body and cremated it in the Forum as a special honor and mark of veneration. So the attitudes I'm talking to you about are elite attitudes toward the past. For most people, it made no difference who was in power. They benefited just as little from one system as they did from the other. Over time, as I said, the Republic became more and more remote. There were initially attempts, feeble attempts to restore it. There was one actual attempt which fizzled out. writers still had hopes that the Republic, they recognize now it was obviously no Republic, but they still had hopes that they could restore it. By the end of the 1st century AD, that hope was more or less given up. And let me quote Tacitus one more time. It's a speech of an emperor in the year 68 AD, who himself was soon to be assassinated in a year of civil war in which there were 4 contenders for the throne. And he appointed a successor, and of course that successor, the worst thing that could have happened to him was being appointed. Because soon after this, the emperor was assassinated, and of course his successor was assassinated as well. If the mighty structure of the empire could stand in even poise without a ruler, that is a republic, right? It would be proper that a republic should begin with me. But as it is, we have long reached such a pass that my old age cannot give more to the Roman people than a good successor, or your youth more than a good emperor. In other words, there was a growing recognition that the republic was no longer feasible. The building in Rome, too, let me give you an example of this. This is a reconstruction of that, one of the niches with the eminent men. Looks nice. Empire also imposed differences in commemoration in the city of Rome. I selected this because you can see the buildings titled in red are Republican buildings. Those in black were built during the imperial period, the empire period, and you can see it's already encroaching. Caesar's Forum, right, even though in a sense it was begun in the Republic, and probably more revealing are looking at the imperial forms in general. This is the center of the old form. This is the scale of the Republic. These are forms built by various emperors. Look at the difference. Basically, the political center has moved away, and it is now overshadowed by imperial constructions. At one time, emperors, I know I'm going on, I'm almost done. At one time, building in the city, public building, was given by the order of the Senate, permission. Now you have to ask the emperor. So senators began to build outside of Rome and in the provinces. So the architecture and commemoration reflected the changed political situation. However, the new situation was greeted, at least by early Christian writers, in a very positive sense, despite the persecution that the church suffered early on. The first church historian was a man called Eusebius, and in 336 he gave an oration of praise to the Emperor Constantine. And this is what he said. At the same time, one universal power, the Roman Empire, arose and flourished, while the enduring and implacable hatred of nation against nation was now removed. And as knowledge of one God and one way of religion and salvation, even the doctrine of Christ, was made known to all mankind, so at the selfsame period, the entire dominion of the Roman Empire being vested in a single sovereign, it was profound peace reigning throughout the world, and thus by the express appointment of the same God, two roots of blessing, the Roman Empire and the doctrine of Christian piety, sprang up together for the benefit of men. And I thought I would end with this, done by Piranesi, one of the greatest of all drawers of Roman ruins. This is, as its title says, sometime in the 1740s. In other words, the forum over time was plundered for building stone, Cows were grazing in the forum. So it simply, basically, for much of the Middle Ages and even in the early Renaissance period, it was a no, its majesty was more or less gone. A few columns were sticking up, a few stones, but more or less it was a ruin, except for this arch here. That's the Arch of Septimius, that's a later emperor at any rate. So I guess all things, in the end, even the grandest, suffer the same fate. Thank you. Have I exhausted you, or does anybody have any questions? If you do, I'll be around. Yes.
I have a comment. This is where they're all there building their, all their wonderful architecture to prove how great and important they are, and this goes on and on and on. It is desperate. And I couldn't help but think of President Donald Trump. An egomaniac, desperate for attention, will lie, do anything. And these people are virtually the same.
No, because
They it's a custom, but they're just desperate, and they're the father of this. The father is a joke. The mother is the one who does everything. You're nothing. You're nothing. No, it's
Well, on that
vanity.
Thank you very much, Mike. Have another question.
Excuse me?
How do you think the Roman Empire would have been different had Caesar lived?
That's what ifs are really tough to answer. If he had been able to pass on power peacefully, Caesar was already by the end of his life becoming autocratic and impatient with traditional procedures. That was one of the reasons why his assassins decided to do away with him, actually. And it probably would have developed into an autocracy, perhaps with less bloodshed and less instability. Whether Caesar had the talent to construct what Augustus did, I don't know. He certainly was an excellent maneuvering tactician, political tactician in the Roman system. He was great. But whether he could construct a new situation, really, while still preserving outwardly the old forms, which I think at this point in time were still necessary to get aristocratic competition. The others didn't care about it one way or the other. I think that he would have been less successful. That's my guess. And he had no male heirs, which would have raised problems.
What kind of education did Augustus have? When did it become apparent that he was talented?
Well, already with Caesar. We know the boy was 18 when Caesar was assassinated. He was born the same year that, well, he was 18 years old. And Caesar was his uncle, once removed, whatever that is. He was a distant uncle, let's put it that way. But he had been campaigning in that area. He recognized the boy's talent. He took him on his last major campaign to Spain in the Civil War when he defeated his final Roman enemies. And so he clearly he wasn't a soldier, really. Even though he added more territory to the Roman Empire than anybody had done so previously. It was done by his commanders and his armies. And at the climatic battle at Philippi in 42 against Brutus and Cassius, it was really Antony who was the general who won the battle. And when he defeated Antony, it was not so much him, but his general, a man called Agrippa, who was key to defeating Antony. So I think his talent was recognized early, but not necessarily for his military abilities. At 18, it's hard to know, right?
Yeah.
But clearly Caesar placed a great deal of trust in him. That's the best I can do.
On the stone monuments, like Nowadays, we have removed some stone monuments that are offensive.
Oh,
Did
yes.
that occur in the Romans as well?
Oh, yes. If
Yeah, I
you,
heard.
I mentioned to you before, this condemnation of memory,
Right,
they destroyed it.
they destroyed it.
Yes. And things they couldn't destroy, they hacked out the names and
Oh,
accomplishments.
my God. Because perspective changing.
To what extent did the Etruscans, who got sort of absorbed into Rome, play a role in their architecture and also in their politics?
Well, they played some role, okay, in their early political structures. And there, in fact, was a section of Rome called the Etruscan neighborhood, the Vicus Etruscus. So they did have influence, and they're tied into stories of, particularly of the earliest period of the kings. But later on, they've been absorbed, for the most part, into the general population. By the end of the 4th century BC, beginning of the 3rd, they had been conquered, and Troy was thoroughly controlled by the Romans. So they played some role, but you hear people, we know their Etruscan background because their names are, but they don't seem to act any differently than anybody else. As far as Etruscan building and so forth, basically they are heavily influenced by the Greeks who had settled in southern Italy. So it's actually our alphabet comes from the Greek alphabet into the Etruscans, and then the Romans modified it. So they did have cultural influence. Some of the, like this ceremony of the triumph seems to have in part roots that go back to the Etruscans. But it was not a major. Anybody else? Yes?
Obviously, Rome dominated the Western world. America today dominates the Western world. Personally, I see America emulating or copying Roman doctrine, Roman control. And I'm curious of your opinion. What do you think America does that emulates the Roman Empire?
There you go, that'll get you.
Nothing like a heavy
Well, it's
question.
different. No, I mean, the answer is states expand. Not Rome, you name it. Whether it's in the ancient Near East, whether it's in the Far East, China, states naturally expand. Every empire that I've ever read about, they expand if they can. If they can't, they don't. The Romans stopped expanding for various reasons. So that our behavior seems to be characteristic of these kinds of states. It's not Rome, it's not the US. It's because large, powerful states expand to control resources, to control their frontiers and borders, to have allies when they need to go to war or do something else. So I think it's similarity. As far as a Roman example, I'm not sure they know anything about Rome anymore. There's a wonderful line from a famous 19th century German philosopher, Hegel, who wrote a philosophy of history. And what he said was, the one thing we learned from history is we don't learn from history.
I think that's a good note to end on.